Hello everyone, and welcome once again to Caleb Blake's Books. Today I have another book review for you, and that is for Darth Bane, Path of Destruction by Karpyshyn. This is the first book in the Star Wars Darth Bane trilogy, and I decided to reread this trilogy. This is the second time I have been reading through it, and this was one of the first Legends books that I read when I got back into reading a few years ago, back in, I believe it would have been 2021. I started getting back into books again. I had read a few Star Wars books before that, and for 2021, that's the majority of what I read was Star Wars. But I had already read like the Jedi Academy trilogy. I'd read some of the Old Republic books, like Revan and Deceived and things like that. I read the Force Unleashed books, and so when I got back into books in 2021, I started with Star Wars books, and I said, okay, when I read some more Legends books, I want to start with the Thrawn trilogy and with Darth Bane, and Darth Bane is the first of those that I actually read, because I had heard so many good things about them, and I had heard like a lot of people say, like, if you're going to really get into the EU, that's kind of where you start. And I decided to start with Darth Bane because I love the Sith and I love the Old Republic era, so that's kind of where I decided to go. And for a long time, I considered the Darth Bane trilogy, and this book specifically, actually, to be my favorite of the EU for a while. And as time's gone on, that's become harder to say simply because I've read so many other good books since then in the EU and in Star Wars in general, even in the canon, that it's kind of become hard for me to say if this really is my favorite of the bunch. But I was very excited to revisit it because it had been a few years, didn't remember that well, and I wanted to see, now that I've read so many other great books, how this one holds up in comparison. And so I read it again, and I really enjoyed it. I would say it is no longer absolute highest top tier for me. Perhaps book 2 or 3 will be at that point, we'll see. But I always considered this one to be my favorite of them and considered this to be in the running for my favorite Star Wars book. I wouldn't say that's the case anymore, but it's still a fantastic book and I really enjoyed it quite a bit. So to start talking good stuff about this book, first of all, I really just like the concept behind this book, which is basically you have this character of Darth Bane, who's a very important character within the history of Star Wars. He's the one that didn't create the rule of 2, but he's the one who really put it into effect in the direct line of him to Palpatine. So he's the one who said, okay, there can only be 2 Sith, and that decision directly led into Palpatine and Vader and all that stuff. Takes place about 1,000 years before the films of Star Wars. And so he's the one that did that, so it's basically telling his story, and this is telling his kind of rise to power, you know, him being taken in by the Sith, being trained, discovering the rule of 2, discovering, you know, that the way that the Sith are going in this time period is not the way, you know, not the true Sith way, and things like that, and him becoming very disillusioned with the Sith and saying, okay, I'm going to be the one to bring the Sith into what they should be. And I really like that idea. I think it's really cool. I also really enjoyed seeing the training parts of this book. For a good chunk of like the second half or so of the, or probably not even, like the whole kind of middle chunk of this book actually is pretty much all Darth Bane at the Sith Academy on Korriban training. I really enjoyed that. I really enjoy the Sith in general in Star Wars, especially like getting more of their philosophy, more of their kind of training, their outlook, things like that. I think they're very interesting, and getting a lot of that in this book is one of the things that it was a big highlight for me. And I also enjoy kind of Bane's progression as a character. You know, he's always fairly powerful throughout this book, but he starts out like, you know, he is able to use the Force more so than most people who have been untrained in the Force, but is kind of then taken and kind of shown the way to really hone his talent in the Force, and then becoming disillusioned with the Sith in general, going to the old Sith Lords and the archives and things, and taking training to the Masters of Old. And I really enjoyed that about it, and I really liked the way that Bane was presented in this book, because even though he is very clearly a bad person, he is evil, he is a villain, or would be a villain in pretty much like your typical Star Wars story. You know, he's a Sith Lord, he's a villain. But this book presents him as the protagonist of his own story. So even though he is a very bad person who you are reading about and you're like, you're doing some very not good things here, you're still rooting for him because he's presented as the protagonist, and you know, you're seeing the way that he interacts with all the other people around him, and you're like, yeah, the Sith really have kind of gone away from the way of the Sith and things like that. So I really enjoyed that aspect of it as well. And I also really enjoy the way that this book ties into Star Wars as a whole, especially the Knights of the Old Republic games. I'm a big fan of Knights of the Old Republic, the first game, and even like collectively the whole duology is my favorite Star Wars thing like ever. I love it a lot. And this book ties very directly into the first Knights of the Old Republic game, being, you know, connections to Darth Revan. Bane trains at the Sith Academy from KOTOR. He goes to other places from KOTOR, which I won't spoil, things like that. So I enjoy kind of the way this connects with everything else, and it feels like it's kind of very, very much connected to those other stories, which makes sense because I believe Drew Karpyshyn also was a writer for Knights of the Old Republic, so that makes sense. So I really enjoyed that about it as well. Now to talk some negative things, which I do have a few things about this book that I was not quite a fan of. I would say the major thing for me is just the quickness of the story, for lack of a better way to put it. The story feels like it moves from one thing to another very quickly, and I really would have liked for some things to have more time spent on them. I feel like this book easily could have either been 2 books or could have had an extra 100 or so pages added to it, and I think it would have been an improvement, because there were parts of this story I would have really liked to see more of, and I feel like it wasn't enough. And even though I enjoyed seeing Bane's progression over the course of the book, and I think it works generally, I think it would work much stronger if there were more of it, because, you know, it felt like he kind of, to me at least, even though, you know, you were told like how he was becoming so powerful, it felt like you weren't really seeing much of that. You were being told like, oh, several months have passed and he's really trained and become, you know, greater and things like that. I would have liked to actually see more of that. I think that would have strengthened his arc and made it feel, you know, a bit better. So I do think that it moves through things a little quickly for my liking. I would have liked to see more of some of that stuff. I also kind of felt like, even though it definitely portrays Bane as a very competent individual at several points, there were certain times where I felt like it maybe went a little too far with it. I don't know how else really to best explain it. There were just times where things seemed a little bit too convenient, or too like, you know, he had these plans and they went, you know, just a little bit too perfectly and things like that. And that doesn't happen in every case. There are some cases where he gets things wrong, but I think in general that's kind of the vibe that I got from certain parts of this book, which, you know, was fine. Again, nothing really major or anything. It was just one of those things that, you know, felt a little weird to me. But overall, I did really enjoy this book a lot. I had a great time revisiting it. It was a super quick read. I went through it in like a couple days. And I enjoyed it a lot. It is not necessarily one of my absolute top Star Wars books anymore, but it is still a great one, and still, if you're a fan of the Sith, if you're a fan of the Old Republic era, anything like that, I still think it's a great place to start with the EU if you're interested, and things like that. So, as far as a rating out of 10 that I would give Path of Destruction, I think I'd give it like an 8.5 out of 10, a bit lower than I used to give it. I would have given it like a 10 out of 10 when I first read it, and for some time afterwards. But now, you know, I still enjoyed it a lot, but it definitely is not the absolute magnum opus, amazing, perfect thing that I kind of remembered it being. You know, it was very, very good for sure, but it is no longer in that top spot for me, but it's still a really good book, and I really enjoyed it a lot, and I would definitely recommend checking it out if you have not before. So that pretty much wraps up my thoughts. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this one, if you have read it, if you've read the whole trilogy, which one of them is your favorite. As I said, this one I would have listed as my favorite, but now that I have started the reread, I am curious if book 2 or book 3 is going to overtake it. I think it's possible for sure, even though there's a lot of things that I personally really like about this one. Like, I really love the training side of it, and I really love the KOTOR tie-ins and things like that. But I'm curious to see if one of the other books will overtake it for me. So let me know in the comments, all that stuff. And that's pretty much it for this video. So thank you all for watching, and I will see you all next time.